Welcome back to the internet discussion for the county seat. We've been talking on our regular broadcast about the RS2477 court case, and we've been talking about the new wildlands initiative from the Department of Interior. So we will continue the dialogue with our guests. We have Mark Ward from the Utah Association of County, Jim Matson, a county commissioner from Kane County, and Doug Heaton, who's also from Kane County. Why we picked that particular county is because that's the county where the RS2477 lawsuit originated. So we found that our original 9-minute discussion was far too short. There's still a whole lot to say. So, Doug, you were chomping at the bit to say something. I'm just gonna let you continue.
Why don't you let somebody else go first? Because I'm yeah, I'm still
putting
gelling.
your thoughts together, Jim.
You know, I think we're still trying to, to get our arms around just what has happened to us after this long struggle. And it really is gratifying to see what the 10th Circuit Court has gone ahead and decided on this particular issue and what that means to us with our local values. And I think in the long run, we're going to be able to see that the rest of the country is going to be able to enjoy the same things we do without having to be concerned about whether or not these areas are being overly abused or at all. And I'd like to point out that from a multiple use standpoint, we've got traditional, cultural, and historical roots in this place that need to be recognized, and they've been there, and we've been the stewards. We'd just like to make sure the new Nauvoo stewards understand how well we've done.
Well put. It's an interesting question that kind of popped into my mind as we were discussing this in the previous segment, is that, and you were talking about the fact that you've got all this wild land and a matter of access. You have a good road system, a transportation system, but I've been on many of the roads. Does it completely eliminate that wilderness solitude experience with the transportation system that you have?
I've lived in that country all of my life. There are significant areas that you could go with the transportation system completely intact and not see another individual for days. No, it does not. All that the transportation system does is provide access to the areas. I mean, you could get out of your car and hike 25 miles after you got to the end of the road. It is huge down there.
Wow.
It's beautiful. The opportunity for solitude will not be interrupted. I can't help but believe that there's another agenda.
Okay. And I'm certainly, we're here for an open conversation. Mark, your thoughts about 3310 and what it's going to do for, what it potentially could do as far as land closures go. According to the BLM, they say we're not really looking at significant changes, and we're not going to do wholesale land grabs. So,
well, we would like to believe the assurances. However, we have a written order, and we have a draft manual that say things that give us a lot of concern, Chad. Public lands management, particularly BLM management, by law is supposed to be driven by a public process called the Resource Management Plan. Those resource management plans were 6 to 8 years in the making. They carefully considered the question of what do we do with lands with alleged wilderness characteristics. They made a reasonable decision in 6 of those RMPs that were approved in 2008. Here's the problem with the Salazar order, the 3310 order. It basically brushes all that aside and takes 2.4 million acres of BLM land, which those 6 RMPs said were not worthy of wilderness-style management, and puts them back on the table just through the stroke of the pen from the Salazar order. Now they say, well, don't worry because we'll carefully review this, and time will have to tell how that all shakes out. But they've laid a groundwork. They put a framework in action that would topple those RMPs, Chad. That takes away the confidence of local people to work on these plans. It disincentivizes the whole idea of a cooperative approach. And so that's the biggest problem with Order 3310. If all of those lands that are proposed as red rock lands, if they became wilderness, that would tie up nearly half of the BLM lands in our entire state. We're talking about energy-rich lands. We're talking about lands with all kinds of different resources, forest resources, travel resources. I could go on and on. Grazing, hard rock mineral, those kinds of things would really put a dent in our economy here if we could not have continued access to that. So
is there a disconnect between what the BLM is saying? Because in attendance of the meeting, they said, we just want to be able to look at this. We're not going to declare all this land off limits to everybody. We just want to look at it. And so if their words say that, is what's on paper indicating something different?
What's on paper creates a default position that those lands should be managed as wilderness. And it gives BLM immediate authority to do so. It's the presumption, it tilts the presumption in favor until BLM does something special to find otherwise. That's the problem. The old mandate, the old presumption was all lands were multiple use unless Congress said otherwise. That's been eroded. We don't even think the BLM has the business, or the right, I should say, to be making administrative decisions about wilderness. Those decisions should be left to Congress. So time will see it all play out, but right now we're very concerned.
You had a thought, Doug?
Yes, I do. It's not just that what's on paper is problematic. What is truly problematic for me is what is historic. The trend that we have followed over the past 50 years from local control to increased federal control, which has inevitably had a tendency to take these lands out of the private sector's reach, place them in a situation where we do not have access to any of the recreational, the mineral, agricultural. There's a tendency to push all of that aside in an attempt to make these areas pristine, untouched.
And what's the, playing devil's advocate, what is some of the evidence to support that? Because that's what people are going to say. Oh yeah, sure. You know, that's an easy claim to make. What are some of the things, you know, like grazing?
Well, Kane County's position right now on the roads stems from a case for controversy in the fact that the federal government closed roads. They just closed them off and said no longer, you can no longer go there. That's an impact. That's a major impact. We've had grazing impacts as there is a trend to remove more and more livestock from the reduce the amount of the livestock allotments, move them off. The trend is there.
There's a definite ratcheting down of the permits. Their permits are expressed in terms of animal unit months, what we call AUMs. That's an amount of forage that necessary to sustain a mother cow and a calf for a month. Is that what it is, Doug? Those AUMs we see on in these proposed wilderness areas are slowly being ratcheted down. Oil and gas access in the Uinta Basin, that's being systematically and thoughtfully cut off in these areas. They're proposed for wilderness. Down in Wayne County, several counties went through a long process with Fish and Wildlife Service to develop a very reasonable motorized access plan around Factory Butte, which is an international mecca for off-road enthusiasts. After months and many meetings, a reasonable plan was set up, but that's being ignored, notwithstanding the fact that the 2008 RMP approved it. Why? Because it's in these so-called proposed wilderness areas. And so what you see is, it's not an effort, Chad, to preserve what's already pristine. Rather, it's an effort to forge, to push off multiple traditional uses, to try to manufacture and forge wilderness. It's not preservation of what's truly wilderness. That all happened in the 1980s, but it's rather a pushing mankind off these areas so we can somehow convert them into wilderness. Isn't that right?
There's no doubt about it. And I think the agencies themselves are somewhat duplicitous in this, because if it becomes designated as wilderness or de facto or wilderness study areas, they simply have to do less and they still keep their jobs and their benefits. It's less difficult to tie it up than it is to really get about the business of making it work for us in this country.
In our interview with Congressman Bishop on this issue, he made a very interesting point, and he said that 3310 is actually managing lands in anticipation of something that may be passed into law in the future. In fact,